The ladle dropped with a wet slap into the dented tin bowl. A thick brown lump of something, warm, shapeless, and trembling slightly, settled like wet clay. Private Carl Beck stared at it without moving. His jaw tightened. Around him, the midday meal line in Camp Larchwood's mess barrack moved forward with the dull rhythm of routine. Wood-planked floors creaked under dozens of boots. Cold light filtered through the high, grime-streaked windows, casting the interior in a dull, amber wash. "Next," barked a kitchen corporal, flicking another dollop into the next tin without looking up. Carl didn't move. The steam rising from his bowl smelled faintly of burnt sugar and something else, an industrial note, like glue left too long in the sun. Behind him, someone muttered low in German, the voice raw from cold air and months of cigarettes. "Süßer Schlamm," the man said. "Sweet mud." There was a ripple of dry laughter behind him. Carl didn't laugh. The American guards leaned casually near the serving station, rifles slung and postures slack, their eyes half-lidded with boredom. One of them, a sergeant with a red birthmark across his cheek, nudged his comrade with an elbow. "Look at 'em," he said, keeping his voice just low enough to sound casual. "You'd think we handed them horse droppings." The other guard snorted. "They don't know what chocolate pudding is." "Probably think it's tank grease." From behind the kitchen window, two army cooks in white caps watched the line with mild amusement. One wiped his hands on his apron and leaned in. "They're not touching it again," he said. "Second day in a row. You'd think we were serving poison." "Far as I know we are," the other replied, deadpan, then cracked a grin. "Standard ration. Comes in crates labeled chalk pudding, INST. Nothing fancy, just surplus from Fort Hamilton." Inside the mess hall, Carl finally moved to a bench near the wall, where other prisoners sat silently, staring into their bowls. The walls echoed with the sound of spoons scraping metal, not from eating, but from stirring, poking, testing. No one dared to swallow. One prisoner near the end of the table dipped a finger into the brown mass and touched it to his tongue. His face twisted. He spat onto the floor. "Not food," he muttered, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. Friedrich Keller, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and sharp cheekbones, leaned in conspiratorially. "It's a sedative," he whispered, "to keep us docile. Makes the brain foggy. I've seen this before. You've seen pudding before?" someone asked dryly from across the table. Keller ignored the comment. "It's chemical. You can smell it, like varnish." He sniffed his bowl again and pushed it away like it was radioactive. Carl glanced at the other men. These were soldiers, many from the Eastern Front, some still bearing old field bandages. Not long ago they would have traded a finger for food. Now they sat stiff-backed and suspicious, refusing dessert. He looked at his bowl again. The surface had formed a skin, a thin, glistening membrane that quivered with the slightest motion. He stabbed it once with his spoon. It folded inward like a deflating balloon. "Why feed us this?" he murmured. Across the table, a younger POW, barely 18, chuckled nervously. "Maybe they want to fatten us for slaughter. Make us soft. Like pigs." A few men laughed, but the sound didn't travel far. The joke wasn't funny. It was camouflage, an attempt to cover something raw and fearful beneath. Carl stood, picked up his tin, and walked to the door. Outside, a crow perched on the fence post, tilting its head toward the hall. He stepped into the cold and flung the contents of the bowl onto the packed dirt. The brown mass splattered, steaming slightly before the bird hopped down and began pecking. Inside the kitchen, one of the cooks leaned against the window frame and whistled. "They're tossing it again," he said, watching through the glass. "Even the birds are eating better than them." "Let 'em starve if they want," came the reply. "Waste of good pudding." In the corner of the mess hall, a lone corporal named James Whitman observed the room quietly. He didn't speak. He simply watched the way the prisoners' eyes flicked toward the exits, the way their backs stayed straight with tension, the way no one trusted the food but no one dared complain. His lips pressed into a thin line. He thought of his older brother, Matthew, who'd died in a POW camp in Tunisia, starved to death after a convoy failed to arrive. He remembered the photo sent home, of bones under skin. Whitman turned and walked toward the kitchen. "Why don't they just tell them what it is?" he asked one of the cooks. "They don't speak English," the cook shrugged, "and it's not our job to babysit." Whitman didn't respond. He looked once more at the line of prisoners, now shrinking as men dumped their bowls and returned to their bunks. They weren't rebellious. They weren't loud. They were quiet. Too quiet. Suspicion brewed silently. Fear, he knew, was rarely loud. Back inside, Carl Beck sat on the edge of his cot, his stomach empty, his thoughts circling like birds above a carcass. He opened a folded scrap of paper and began to write in the margins of an old Red Cross leaflet. "We don't understand what they feed us. We don't know what it's made of. We are not starving now, but we are not safe either." He paused, looked up toward the ceiling, and folded the paper away. Behind the barracks, the crows had eaten every scrap. They thought we were poisoning them with dessert. Captain Raymond Haskett didn't even sit down. His boots were still damp from the morning frost as he stepped into the makeshift admin tent, the canvas flaps fluttering behind him in the November wind. He carried a clipboard tucked under his arm and wore a look of someone who'd had enough. The complaints weren't new, but what unsettled him this time wasn't noise or disobedience. It was the silence, the kind that settles when distrust replaces curiosity. He walked straight to the duty sergeant's desk where Private Langley was sorting mail with a pencil clenched between his teeth. Haskett cleared his throat. "POWs are refusing dessert again," he said. "Third day in a row. Entire batch untouched." Langley barely looked up. "Pudding again." "Yes, they think it's something else. Sludge. Waste. One of them smeared it on the side of the barrack and said it wouldn't melt in the sun." Haskett handed over the clipboard. "Filed under non-compliance, but I recommend reviewing the labeling." Maybe a visual guide or an interpreter. Langley gave the paper a cursory glance and slid it into a folder marked Camp Ops, MISC. "I'll pass it up the chain," he muttered, eyes already back on the envelopes. "You won't," Haskett said flatly, "and I'll see the same damn crates show up next week while half the prisoners think we're feeding them paint." Outside the tent, the wind picked up. Somewhere in the yard, a mess bucket clanged against the wire fence. Inside, Langley chuckled. "Let 'em think that." "One less spoon we gotta wash." Haskett didn't laugh. His jaw tightened. "You think this is funny?" Langley finally looked up. "Sir, with respect, they're enemy soldiers." "What do you want me to do? Label it pudding in cursive with a flower next to it?" Haskett stared for a beat, then turned sharply and walked out, the flap snapping closed behind him. The form would never leave the folder. It would sit between requisition reports and missing sock tallies until mildew or a fire claimed it, whichever came first. In Washington, D.C., thousands of miles and 1,000 more attitudes away, a procurement officer with the Army's Subsistence Research and Development Branch was signing off on a new distribution manifest. His name was Edwin Hartley, a man who wore his optimism like his tie, tight, clean, and always centered. He skimmed the requisition form before stamping it. 10,000 units. Instant chocolate dessert. Model 4. B. His assistant blinked. "That much? It's popular with troops. Doesn't spoil, and the Red Cross doesn't complain," Hartley said with a smile. "Besides, it's technically dessert." Keeps morale up. He had no idea the same pudding was being scraped into latrine pits across 8 POW camps in the Midwest. No one told him, no one thought to, and the system was never designed to listen downward. Back in Camp Larchwood, Sergeant Nolan leaned against the mess barracks side door, flicking ash from a cigarette while watching the prisoners file past the chow line. "Here comes the sweet mud parade," he muttered to Corporal James Whitman, who was stacking tin trays near the door. Whitman didn't laugh. "They haven't touched it again," he said, nodding toward the untouched pans of brown goo. Nolan shrugged. "They think it's fuel grease or something." Let 'em waste it. We've got more in storage than we know what to do with. Whitman exhaled slowly. His gaze drifted to the prisoners, men in faded field jackets, their shoulders hunched not just from cold, but from a kind of suspicion that seemed to deepen each day. He thought of his brother Daniel, captured during the fall of Tobruk in 41, starved, dehydrated, unburied. When the telegram came, it hadn't said much, just deceased in captivity. No further details. What if they're scared? Whitman said quietly. Not stupid. Nolan scoffed. They're fine. Health inspections pass. No one's bleeding out. If they don't like pudding, they can skip it. They think we're tricking them. Whitman pressed, stepping closer, voice low. What if you were given something you couldn't name, couldn't place by the same people who locked you in a fence? Nolan's smirk faltered. He turned his eyes back to the field. We're not running a hotel. I know, Whitman said, but we're not supposed to run a zoo either. The tray in his hand clattered slightly as he stacked it harder than intended. Later that evening, after lights out, Whitman lingered behind the barracks alone. He watched the last of the day's trash burn in the pit near the fence. Among the smoke, half-melted tins of pudding bubbled and hissed. Somewhere nearby, a prisoner coughed in the cold. He pulled his jacket tighter and thought of Daniel again. What he might have made of all this. How he might have laughed at the absurdity of dying on one side of a wire while men on the other side threw chocolate into fire. That same week, a Red Cross observer named Bennett Hall visited the camp for his monthly survey. A thin, quiet man with round glasses and an ever-present notepad, he watched the lunch service with a puzzled expression. At the sight of dozens of untouched dessert tins, he made a note. Possible cultural confusion. Recommend printed labels in German. Consider demonstration by trusted party. He passed the comment to the liaison officer. It was stamped low priority by a clerk who couldn't pronounce Kartoffelsalat, let alone understand the concept of culinary fear. By Friday, the crates of pudding kept arriving. By Sunday, the guards had started betting who could get a POW to take a bite. And by Monday, another case of untouched dessert was carted to the waste pit without question. Corporal Whitman stood by the mess hall window, arms folded, watching two prisoners wordlessly pass their bowls forward without touching the brown scoop. Behind him, Nolan tossed a joke over his shoulder. Maybe next time, we should put sprinkles on top. Call it liberation paste? Whitman didn't respond. He just stared through the glass. A world of miscommunication was being served one ladle at a time. When laughter fills the silence, no one hears the fear underneath. The diary page trembled slightly beneath Private Otto Drexler's fingers, though not from cold. The barracks stove hissed steadily in the corner, casting a faint orange glow against the frost-laced window panes of Barracks 12. But Otto's hands, once steady from years spent kneading dough in his father's bakery back in Leipzig, couldn't seem to stop shaking as he wrote. The Americans do not beat us, but they confuse us. They give us sludge. It is brown and soft. It does not rot. It smells sweet, but none of us believe it is food. The scratch of his pencil was the only sound for a moment, broken only when the door creaked open and a burst of cold air swept in. Still writing, Otto? Eric Brandt asked, stepping inside and pulling off his threadbare gloves. He was tall, raw-boned, with the nervous energy of a man who hadn't fully slept in months. Otto didn't look up. It helps. Helps what? To remember I still have thoughts they don't own. Eric gave a soft grunt and settled on the bunk above Otto's. From his coat pocket he pulled a crust of black bread and chewed on it noisily. They gave us that pudding again, he muttered through a mouthful. Slopped it into my bowl like pig feed. Otto set the pencil down carefully. You didn't eat it, did you? I threw it into the stove, Eric said with a shrug. Smelled like glue when it burned. The memory of the thick brown mass settling into Otto's tin bowl returned unbidden. its skin glossy under the overhead light, steam curling off it like something alive. The guards said nothing when they served it, just ladled it out with blank faces. "I've never smelled anything like it," Otto admitted. "It's not meat. It's not bread. It's something else. I heard Keller say it's a sedative," Eric said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Something to make us dull." Easier to manage, Otto exhaled through his nose. Keller also believes the Red Cross is a front for American intelligence. "That doesn't make him wrong," Eric said, wiping crumbs from his chin. "You were a baker, weren't you? Didn't you study flavors?" Otto nodded once, the motion slow and deliberate. "I can name 100 spices by smell. I've baked chocolate tarts, marmorkuchen, sweet loaves, but this pudding, they give us, it doesn't smell like any chocolate I've ever known. It smells," he paused, "industrial." For a moment, neither man spoke. Outside, a gust of wind swept over the camp, rattling the tin roof above them. Then came a voice from across the room. "I say they're fattening us up." Otto and Eric turned to see Friedrich Keller sitting up in his bunk, eyes hollow but sharp. "Fattening us?" Eric repeated. "For what?" Otto asked. Keller's voice was quiet. "For slaughter." Eric scoffed, but Otto looked down at the page again, his pencil resting above the final sentence. He didn't write anything more that night. By the end of the week, the pudding had returned twice more. Both times it was met with silence, suspicion, and eventual refusal. Some prisoners made a show of dumping it outside. Others smeared it on bread and fed it to birds. When a crow dropped dead near the fence, likely from the cold, word spread that the pudding had killed it. It didn't matter that birds scavenged from trash piles all the time. What mattered was that belief had taken root. The kitchen staff, watching from the far side of the wire fence, laughed quietly behind their aprons. To them, it was surplus stock from the mainland, cheap, filling, shelf-stable, chocolate pudding by the drum, boxed and labeled in code. None of them thought the Germans needed an explanation. Food was food. But inside the camp, trust eroded. Guards began to notice signs. Men leaving more on their trays. Skinnier faces. Longer naps during work detail. Sergeant Nolan filed a short report. POWs demonstrating mild resistance to rations. Recommend encouragement. The recommendation came down from admin. No clarification necessary. Maintain routine. So instead of answers, they sent more pudding. Otto tried to focus during latrine duty, but he moved with a growing sluggishness. His stomach had adjusted to less food. His bones felt colder now, even in the early spring sun. One afternoon, while emptying a bucket behind the barracks, he caught sight of Corporal Whitman watching him from across the yard. The American's face showed no emotion, just a distant calculation, as if measuring something unseen. That night, Otto sat on his bunk as the others played cards using torn bits of crate wood as chips. He unwrapped a small pencil stub and opened the diary again. This time, he wrote not as a man trying to document war, but as someone trying to preserve his own logic in the face of nonsense. "They do not beat us, but they do not explain themselves. They give us soft things that smell like a trick. I try to imagine them giving this to their own children. I cannot." He paused, biting his lip until it almost bled. Then he added, "We are not starving anymore." But we are starving for answers. A loud knock on the barracks door startled everyone. A young American guard stepped in, holding a tin tray stacked with bowls. The smell filled the room immediately, warm, sweet, thick. The pudding again. The guard dropped it at the table with a grin. "Bon appétit," he said in a mocking French accent, then walked out without another word. Otto stood slowly. He stared at the bowl. Around him, no one moved. Eric leaned close again. "I dare you to try it." Otto didn't respond. He looked at the bowl, then at his diary, then at the door. That night the wind howled like a warning. Otto pulled the blanket tight and stared at the ceiling. His stomach grumbled, but his hand refused to reach under the bed where the untouched bowl still sat. He didn't sleep. And when he wrote in his diary the next morning, his words were brief but sharp as razors. We were no longer starving, but we didn't trust the hands that fed us. The translator stood in the doorway of the mess hall with sunlight at his back and silence in front of him. Franz Miller, once a schoolteacher in a small Missouri town, now stood in a military-issue overcoat, gripping a white enamel tray that trembled slightly in his hands. His frame was wiry with age, shoulders hunched from decades of chalk dust and chalkboard lectures. His eyes, however, sharp beneath wire-framed spectacles, were focused and alive. The American guards who escorted him in had already stepped aside, unsure what to expect. Inside the barrack, rows of German POWs sat at wooden tables, spoons idle in hand, their bowls filled with the same thick brown pudding they had feared, mocked, and avoided for weeks. Corporal James Whitman stood against the far wall, arms crossed, jaw set. He'd spent 2 weeks watching untouched tins pile up, 2 weeks listening to whispered paranoia and muttered German slurs about sweet mud, sedatives, and worse. He'd tried to explain. Once he'd even pantomimed eating the pudding in front of them. It hadn't helped. His fellow guards laughed behind his back, said he was soft, wasting time. But James had seen what starvation did to men. His brother had died in a Luftwaffe camp with his stomach half empty and his dignity drained. This wasn't just about pudding. This was about trust. And trust, he believed, started with something small. Now Muller stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he walked calmly to the first table, held up his tray like a teacher introducing a new lesson, and said, "Dies ist Schokoladenpudding." His German was gentle, clean, without the sharp edges of command. A few heads turned. Others remained still, watching carefully, uncertain whether this was a trick or a punishment. Otto Drexler sat at the second table from the front, his diary hidden beneath his mattress, his skepticism carved into the lines of his face. He leaned slightly forward, his arms resting on the edge of the table. His bowl sat untouched in front of him, the pudding's glossy surface reflecting the overhead light like mud after rain. Muller noticed him. The translator took a spoon, scooped a small bite from his tray, and held it just under his chin. Eyes locked on Otto. "Essen," he said simply. "Watch." Otto didn't move. Then, slowly, Muller placed the spoon in his mouth, chewed, and swallowed. He smiled warmly without performance. Not mockery, not force, just a man showing another man it was safe. A breath caught in Otto's throat. Behind him, Eric whispered, "It's still a trick." But his voice lacked certainty now. Otto stood, taking one slow step forward, then another. His boots made a quiet tap on the floorboards. Muller said nothing more. He held the spoon out to Otto, letting him take it directly. Otto stared at the tin. The smell, burnt sugar, milk, something vaguely familiar, rose from the surface like a ghost from his childhood. A pastry shop in Leipzig. A square of cake from his mother's hand. He hadn't thought of that in months. He dipped the spoon. One bite, it melted on his tongue. Sweet, soft, not poison, not punishment. His lips parted in disbelief. "It's Schokolade?" he asked, voice barely audible. Muller nodded once. "Ja." The silence cracked. A quiet murmur rippled through the room like the shift of wind before a storm. Chairs scraped back. Men rose. One by one, they approached the serving line. Some held out their trays with cautious hands. Others hesitated until they saw Muller take another bite, smiling with grandfatherly patience. In the far corner, a man named Friedrich Keller laughed once, sharply, like someone waking from a bad dream. Another, Private Carl Beck, the same who first called it sweet mud, rubbed the back of his neck in shame before sheepishly stepping forward with his bowl. Eric, still seated, crossed his arms. "They're soft," he muttered. Otto turned back, holding his spoon like a flag. "No," he said. "They're hungry." The guards didn't know what to do. Sergeant Nolan stood by the door with a furrowed brow and tight lips. "You seeing this?" he muttered to the corporal next to him. "I see pudding getting eaten," the other man replied, almost stunned. Corporal Whitman didn't move from his spot, but a slow breath escaped his chest. Muller had done what no regulation had allowed, what no order had achieved. Trust had been given, not commanded, and it had been received. One prisoner cried, quietly, over his tray. Not from sadness, but relief. The sound of laughter followed, soft at first, then louder. Not ridicule, but reunion. Men speaking to each other again, not about fear or suspicion, but about flavor. Childhood. Memory. A few even joked, in broken English, asking if seconds were allowed. Corporal Whitman walked slowly toward the serving table. He nodded at the mess hall cook, a red-faced sergeant who still looked unsure whether he was witnessing a breakthrough or a breakdown. "Put more on their trays," Whitman said calmly. "Let them have as much as they want." By the end of the meal, the entire pot of pudding had been emptied. Not a single bowl was returned untouched. That night, Otto returned to Barracks 12 and retrieved his diary. He wrote without stopping, his pencil scratching across the page like a man trying to preserve something sacred before it slipped away again. Behind him, Eric said nothing. But he didn't mock. He simply ate his portion quietly, spoon after spoon, as if the act itself had become its own form of apology. In the guard barracks later that evening, someone asked Whitman what had happened. He didn't look up from his tray as he replied. "We mistook kindness for a weapon until it tasted like childhood." The shift began with a second scoop. Corporal James Whitman, sleeves rolled to the elbow and apron dusted with powdered cocoa, stood behind the serving line, ladle in hand. Steam curled from the industrial-sized vat of chocolate pudding beside him. He didn't speak as Otto Drexler approached with his tin tray, shoulders squared and eyes cautious. The two locked eyes briefly, no words, no nods, just a flicker of recognition, and Whitman leaned forward, scooping a second helping into the center of Otto's tray. Otto paused. "Danke," he said quietly. Whitman didn't answer. He only watched as Otto stepped aside, eyes wide, mouth twitching with an emotion too subtle to name. The next man in line muttered something in German. Otto didn't respond. He sat alone, back straight, and tasted the pudding as though tasting memory itself. Inside the mess barrack, the mood was different now. No more tense whispers or sideways glances at the brown mass on their trays. Instead, there were smirks, jokes, bets on who could eat the most. Even the guards noticed it. One nudged another as a group of prisoners stacked their empty bowls into a wobbling pyramid and laughed when it collapsed. "What the hell's gotten into them?" one guard asked. "Sugar," said another. "Or maybe forgiveness." In Barracks 12 that evening, Otto Drexler returned to his bunk and opened his diary beneath the dim yellow light of a wall-mounted bulb. His handwriting, once tight and suspicious, flowed freely now. It was not poison. It was something they give to their own children. "I think I understand now. Not everything here is meant to humiliate us. Some things just are." He stopped writing and stared at the final line. He didn't scratch it out. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, Sergeant Nolan sat stiffly at his desk inside the camp's administrative trailer. A reprimand form lay open before him, stamped with the official seal of the camp's internal review committee. The language was sterile. Violation of military perimeter protocol, unauthorized civilian entry. There was no mention of pudding, of mistrust, or of the translator, Franz Miller, who had changed the trajectory of morale with a spoonful of dessert. Nolan grunted and tossed the paper aside. "Reprimanded for pudding," he muttered. "What's next? Court-martial for smiling." Outside, frost coated the wire fence perimeter. A Red Cross representative had passed through 2 days earlier but didn't stay long. He asked a few questions, took no notes, and filed a standard report under nutrition adjustments. When the form reached Fort Douglas Regional Headquarters, it was scanned and archived, unread. Inside the mess hall, Corporal Whitman scraped pudding residue from the sides of the pot with methodical rhythm, his thoughts elsewhere. The clang of metal against steel echoed in the quiet kitchen. The cooks had long since left, but he stayed behind, as he often did now, cleaning without being asked. He found himself thinking not of war, or orders, or even the upcoming shipment manifest. He thought of his brother, Samuel, captured in Tunisia, never found. He thought of what Samuel might have eaten or refused on the other side of the wire. Maybe they never explained it to him either, Whitman murmured aloud, voice low, eyes fixed on his own reflection in the steel wall of the pot. Maybe he died thinking they were mocking him, too. His hands froze. The ladle slipped into the pot with a soft splash. He gripped the sink and stared down at his trembling knuckles. That night, in the barracks, one of the younger POWs, Eric, tried his first joke in English. "I will trade boots for extra pudding," he said, grinning and tapping his tray. The guards didn't laugh, but the prisoners did, and that was enough. It wasn't much, but it was something. Back in the kitchen, Whitman resumed scrubbing. A scalding pipe hissed beside him. He didn't flinch. Later, Sergeant Nolan passed through the kitchen on his nightly inspection. He paused when he saw Whitman still there, hands red from steam and soap. "You don't get overtime for polishing pots," Nolan grunted. "I know," Whitman replied without looking up. "Orders are clear now." No more civilians in the mess hall. That old translator stunt could have caused real trouble. You're lucky it wasn't worse. Whitman turned slightly, wiping his hands on his apron. His face was unreadable. And if it helped? Nolan stared at him. "Doesn't matter." "That's not your call." The air between them thickened, but Whitman said nothing more. He returned to the sink, the hot water rising again. Later that week, the official incident log was updated. Entry 11.4.44. Minor food issue resolved. Prisoners now compliant. No further action required. The line sat buried beneath requisition requests and tire rotation schedules. Yet each evening, when pudding was served, Whitman still gave Otto a second scoop. Sometimes their eyes met, sometimes not. But always the spoon paused, just long enough to make the act intentional. No one else seemed to notice. No one commented. But something had changed. And later that night, when the kitchen emptied and the metal trays clattered clean and forgotten in their racks, Whitman found himself whispering a truth that no uniform could make official, no logbook could record, and no reprimand could erase. Maybe the war won't end with a treaty, but with something as simple as a spoon, Ensign Miles Rudd didn't like wasting time, but this morning felt like an exception. Rain tapped steadily against the canvas roof of the temporary intelligence tent at Fort Delmont, where a leaking oil stove hissed in the corner and made everything smell faintly like burnt metal. He hunched over a typewriter, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, fingers paused above the keys. He stared at the memo he had already half-typed, a summary document intended for the War Office's Cultural Intelligence Division. Its title line read simply, "Behavioral Observations, Civilian and POW Morale, Non-Critical." That was the classification, but Rudd knew the stories buried beneath the headings deserved more than dust. He inserted a fresh carbon sheet and began typing again, this time slower with more intent. Final case study, Camp Larchwood, Iowa, pudding incident. The words felt absurd, like a footnote to a joke no one else had laughed at. But for Rudd, who had interviewed quartermasters, guards, and even a translator over the last 6 weeks, it was no joke. The summary was small, yes, but it revealed something vast. Fear in the absence of explanation, kindness mistaken for cruelty, and the stubborn blindness of protocol. He reached into a brown folder marked Rations and Reactions, pulling out a black and white photograph. A young German POW holding a dented pudding tin, grinning like a boy who'd just found a toy. The camp cook had taken the photo on a whim. Rudd remembered the story, how the prisoners thought the pudding was a sedative, how they called it sweet mud, how the translator, Muller, had taken a spoonful first, daring them to believe it was safe, and how, afterward, the men had laughed as they hadn't in months. But laughter wasn't policy. Rudd stood, paced once, and then sat back down. He began typing faster now, his words pressing into the paper like a warning and a confession. American food, though ample, has often created unintentional psychological stress within Axis POW populations due to cultural unfamiliarity and inconsistent labeling. The case of Camp Larchwood illustrates the potential for morale degradation and resistance not through abuse, but through miscommunication. He stopped to underline that last word twice. From the adjacent tent came a burst of chatter, two senior analysts joking about a shipment of canned pineapple being too fancy for prisoners. One voice snorted, "Let 'em think it's horse glue, who cares?" Rudd's jaw clenched. He thought of Corporal Whitman, the man who'd arranged the translator visit despite regulations. Whitman hadn't spoken much in their interview, just quietly handed over Otto Drexler's diary, a brown leather thing with careful handwriting, and said, "You'll want to read page 14. He had. That page still haunted him. It is not poison. It is something they give to their own children. Miles turned back to the memo. He added a final suggestion. It is advised that future rations provided to POW camps include translated labels, visual dietary aids, and brief culinary explanations to avoid further cultural misinterpretations. A small pamphlet or daily menu board would suffice. He signed his name at the bottom, Ensign M. Rudd, Cultural Liaison Division. Then, almost as an afterthought, he scribbled a personal note in the margin next to the attached photo. It wasn't the chocolate they feared, it was the silence around it. Satisfied, he slipped the report into a manila envelope and walked it across the gravel compound toward the command office. He passed rows of parked supply trucks, two tired mess clerks scrubbing pots, and a Red Cross van pulling away in the mud. Inside, a corporal with thick glasses and a stack of forms looked up without smiling. "Delivery for CI Division," Miles said, handing the envelope across the desk. The corporal took it, looked at the label, and shrugged. "Non-critical," he muttered. Then, without looking, he tossed it into a gray tray behind him marked Low Tier, Process Later. The envelope landed softly atop a dozen others, some yellowed with age, others unopened. Miles hesitated. For a second he thought of speaking up, arguing, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the war weariness in the room. Maybe it was the stack of folders no one had read. Or maybe it was the knowledge that change, real change, rarely began with shouting. So he walked out. The rain had stopped. The sky was dull and colorless, the kind that made everything look like a faded photograph. Decades passed. In a temperature-controlled archive beneath the National Military Records Building, a historian named Clark Emery thumbed through brittle folders labeled Miscellaneous. POW Observations. He had nearly skipped the one titled Culinary Cultural Incidents, 1944 to 45, until the paperclip holding the photo caught his thumb. Curious, he pulled the sheet out. A single image. A German POW, maybe 18, grinning as he held a pudding tin. Below it, a memo with crisp block letters, and in the margin, a handwritten line in faded ink that stopped Emery cold. He whispered it aloud, almost reverently. It wasn't the chocolate they feared, it was the silence around it. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of culture, surprise, and shared humanity amid conflict. Its purpose is to entertain while reminding us that even in times of division, simple pleasures can reveal our common ground.